By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
It is so good to be back together again as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Today, we're starting a new chapter in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 23. And I absolutely love this section that we're moving towards in Matthew. Matthew 23 is Jesus' deriding the scribes and Pharisees, and lots of good, juicy information there that is actually helpful for us as we look at ourselves and look at spiritual leaders today. And then on into Matthew 24 and 25, the Olivet Discourse, all that end time stuff. So I'm really looking forward to uncovering that together as we work our way through this. Now, you will recall that in Matthew 22, Jesus had just been speaking to Pharisees and Sadducees who came to test him on various questions, trying to nail him on something that he'd say publicly that they could use against him in order to affect his death, which they did. But Jesus wasn't fooled. He wasn't stumped on any occasion. And once their questioning is over, once they're silenced, then Jesus begins to address the crowd regarding his opinion of the scribes and Pharisees. And he spends a whole chapter on it in Matthew's Gospel anyways. Really, really good stuff. Let's begin reading in verse number 1 of Matthew chapter 23. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, so it's a mixed group, saying, quote, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them." And he elaborates on that. So we'll go into the elaboration in just a second. The whole, that phrase, the chair of Moses, there's some question as to whether it's just a phrase that Jesus used spontaneously that didn't have any reference to any literal chair. So it's just a way of saying that they put themselves in the place of authority, speaking on behalf of Moses and the law of Moses. But there are some who make some attempt to tell us, and I think they have some legitimacy, I don't know whether it's true or not, that of course in every synagogue there was a certain seat from which, when the scrolls were read by the leader of the synagogue, he would sit in that seat that perhaps was called the seat of Moses. I kind of tend towards that because of what Jesus says, because he says, do what they tell you to do. Well, if they were doing their perverse teaching, twisting the law of Moses and making it meaningless and nullifying the commandments of God, then I don't think Jesus could have said that. I think he's only could be making reference to when they're reading to you, when they're quoting to you from the law of Moses, from the official seat within the synagogue. When you hear that on the Sabbath, then do what they tell you to do, because they are reading from the law of God, the law of Moses. But, when they're giving their sermons and then taking scriptures out of context and twisting them, and as we've talked about so many times, you wouldn't want to listen to them then. Jesus spent a great deal of time correcting the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. So that's my take on that. And he says, so again, back in verse number 3, therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. Again, has to be when they're reading from the law. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. So there were things that they were saying that were right and proper. Anytime they read from the law of Moses, that'd be the case, right? Sure. So do it, but they're not doing it, so don't imitate them. And then here's the elaboration. In verse number 4 of 23, they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. And so it seems that that's a criticism of them even going beyond the requirements of the law, because Jesus refers to it as heavy burdens that are laid upon people's shoulders by the scribes and Pharisees. If that was a reference to the law of Moses, that would be a criticism of himself, right? Because Jesus, in one way or another, we could say, gave the law of Moses. He was and is God, and it was given by God. So it seems like, again, this is that they're taking the law of Moses and even adding a considerable burden to it. And we know historically that is exactly what the case was. For hundreds of years, the spiritual leaders in Israel had been building what were known then as fence laws that were all written down. You can read them today. And they were designed to keep people from ever transgressing God's law, but by putting a fence around them. So if you keep these fence laws, there's no way you're ever going to, commit the sin of breaking God's actual law. Remember, we've talked about some of those things before. The whole thing about, you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Well, they took that one commandment and then built all kinds of commandments around it to where today, you have that all the kitchen separation of dairy and of meat and so forth, lest we inadvertently somehow boil a kid in its mother's milk and so forth. And so those were part of the fence law. So I think those, in my opinion, are what Jesus was talking about. These fence laws, these extraordinary burdens that God never intended for people to have to be even thinking about. Okay, and here's the hypocrisy of it. These guys who are making these fence laws that are becoming these huge burdens upon people beyond just the 600 laws of the old covenant, they're given those laws, they're formulating those laws, but they themselves aren't even keeping those laws. Okay, and I think this chapter has a great deal of application to spiritual leaders in the past and in the present as well. Certainly, it's directed at Israel's spiritual leaders, and so this would be a good chapter for spiritual leaders today to examine themselves in light of what Jesus said. It'd be good for all of us to examine ourselves in light of what Jesus said, because there are spiritual principles. Jesus is going to tell us a lot of things that he doesn't like about spiritual leaders, but not just spiritual leaders, about people who are under spiritual leaders. Okay, so all of us probably are in that category. We need to take heed to what he says. So, that being said, I'm very excited to spend some sessions here with you as we work our way through Jesus' denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees. Okay, so there's a lot more to come, and it's going to be good. All right, love going through the Word of God with you, and so I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.